welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I am one of your hosts today, Jen, and I am joined by the fantabulous
Jessica, and not Lady Jessica from Dune. I know we're talking about Dune, and it's very funny to me because it makes me very happy that my name is used for a character in a sci-fi series like that. So yes, I am Jessica, the librarian, not Lady Jessica. I don't know any of those hand signals to communicate, but I wish I did.
Yet.
Yet.
And we are here with a fantastic author who joined us last year with a book about Star Trek that was one of my favorite books of the year. And I am so excited to talk about this next one. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. I'm Ryan Britt. I am the author of The Spice Must Flow, which is a new nonfiction book about the whole history of Dune. And I just want to say, saying Jessica the librarian does not make you sound any less sci-fi. That just sounds
Awesome.
more, right? Doesn't that just sound more like a sci-fi
100%.
title? You're not
for sure, but I still do want to learn those hand signals to communicate. It would be so helpful.
It's funny, the hand signals show up in the later books. They're not as prominent in the first book. But in the movie, they have them, they have her doing the hand signals in the Villeneuve movie. But yeah, I was rereading all the books for researching this book. I was like, oh, it's really in Children of Dune where they really do the hand signal thing more, which is something I had forgotten.
Well, this is such a fun book, and it's such a fun world to explore. And it's an interesting turn, from the Star Trek book, because Star Trek is very utopian and aspirational, and Dune, isn't really. I don't know if we want to live in the world of Dune the same way you might want to live in the world of Star Trek. So what inspired that turn? And, how did you pick this next project from that?
Well, I think that ultimately, Star Trek and Dune have similar messages, oddly. It's just how they're depicted, right? Dune is sort of this is how things kind of go wrong. And Star Trek is kind of this is how things go right. But I would say that the moral messaging is somewhat similar, right? Same with Star Wars, right? Star Wars is very different than Star Trek, but it's not the people that live in an oppressive galaxy are yay, whereas the people that live in the Star Trek, galaxy are kind of we have it pretty good, but it could be better. I think that Frank Herbert, first of all, was one of the first science fiction authors to sign a petition to keep Star Trek on the air in 1966, right? Before the fan one, Frank Herbert was one of the science fiction authors, including Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein, that Harlan Ellison contacted to say, hey, we're sending this petition to NBC to save Star Trek. And Herbert signed off on that. What he thought of Star Trek in general is sort of unknown. But at the time in the 60s, he was supportive of serious science fiction. So, I think that to answer your question more directly is that I like writing about science fiction franchises that have multiple messages, right? And I think that Dune doesn't necessarily depict what its message is, right? It's not becoming a tyrant is good, but it's saying this is how it could happen. I think that my Star Trek book was about metamorphosis, right? Radical metamorphosis of pop culture and science fiction ideas throughout several decades. And I think that the Dune book I learned as I was writing it is about contradictions. Is about holding sort of contradictory ideas in your mind simultaneously. And I think the best science fiction does that, right? Why did I decide to do another book I was writing this as Phasers on Sun was coming out. It just hadn't been done. No one had done it. No one had, with the Star Trek book, a billion people had been here's the whole history of Star Trek. And I was yes, but I'm going to do it funnier and faster and more updated. But with Dune, I kind of realized that, Brian Herbert had written that nice, wonderful biography of his father. There had been lots of books about the individual films. And there have been a lot of academic texts that focused on very specific things, but there was nothing that was just for a regular reader coming in 2023 who perhaps was interested in the novels because of the new film, that was like, hey, how did this start? You kind of have to go to this truncated Wikipedia page or, a sort of half completed list on a website. And I thought, it would be really nice to do this and do it in the same style as my other books. That was really accessible and but yeah, I mean, the first 5 chapters are pretty much publishing and literary history. And so I liked being able to do a book that started as kind of a literary history book, then kind of became sort of like a Hollywood did you know book.
As you were talking, yeah, that did remind me that, yeah, they're both like transmedia
Right.
franchises as well. Yes, you get to trace them across multiple media. And would you say that you think you know, they both thrive in a particular one of those forms, or is it sort of like the more of the whole's greater of the parts, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, Star Trek is interesting because, the two biggest science fiction franchises, right? Star Trek and Star Wars, like that's Doctor Who's like close third, right? They all have literary components, right? Like Star Trek relied very heavily on 1960s science fiction authors as some of its writers. And then as time went on, book writers were integral to keeping Star Trek alive. Nicholas Meyer was a Sherlock Holmes novelist who wrote and directed Star Trek Wrath of Khan. I just literally bumped into Michael Chabon in a local Portland bookstore here in Portland, Maine on Friday. And we were chatting, he's the co-creator of Star Trek Picard, but of course is better known as, and he's a massive Dune fan. You know what I mean? But Star Trek, and then, of course, George Lucas was very influenced by a lot of different science fiction literature, including Dune, to do Star Wars. So, Douglas Adams wrote Doctor Who in the 70s, right? So, like, there's like that. I mean, I was just watching City of Death the other day, which was a Douglas Adams sort of edited script from the Tom Baker years, and it's just like it came out the same year as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, this particular Doctor Who stretch of episodes. It's like mind-blowing, but it has all of that literary wit. So I think the best science fiction TV and film franchises often have literary roots. Dune, though, is primarily books, right? Like, and I think what is so fascinating about Dune, and I knew this a little bit from working in science fiction publishing when I was a bit younger, and some of that's in the book about working with David Hartwell, who was the editor on Children of Dune. I worked with him towards the end of his life. He, in the 70s, was the guy who pressed Putnam to make Children of Dune a higher print run, because at that time he knew that it was a phenomena, is that science fiction novels as bestsellers we owe to Dune. And that is very interesting, right? Like if you're just a book person and you're someone who says SF and not sci-fi because you're talking about print versus visual, then Dune is the Lord of the Rings of science fiction, right? It is the thing that has not really been surpassed. And something that I was talking with my agent and my editor at Penguin about when we were doing this is like, well, we know people buy Dune books, because they've been buying them for 60 years. And so I think that tracing the like, ooh, we almost didn't get a book version of Dune, and it almost just sort of languished in magazine format, because it was published as serials in Analog magazine from 63 to 64. That was really fascinating to me to like, because you read these articles online, it'll be like one line, it'll be like Dune was rejected 20 times and then it was bought by Chilton Books, and it's like, wait, what? How did that happen? Like, what was this, process there? So, I spent several pages on that. You know what I mean? I went through all the letters and, cross-referenced some things. So, and I'm a book person, and I love, like you say, the science fiction that is transmedia, the Expanse books and the Expanse shows, and, or fantasy with Lord of the Rings and, all that stuff. But it is interesting that I would probably say that the best version of Dune is still those novels, particularly those first three. And if you want proof of that, like, you don't have to take my word for it. Just like read it, and also talk to any writer in any genre who likes Dune, because it's not just science fiction writers. It's people that are much more talented and smarter than me, like Michael Chabon or my friend Karen Russell. They love Dune. And there's got to be a reason why these different types of novelists are so drawn to it. And so that to me was the most important thing to celebrate, at least in the first half of the book.
So was there anything that you kind of like while you were doing research for this book that you kind of discovered that you hadn't known before that just like got you really, really excited?
Quite a bit, honestly, quite a bit. The fact that Children of Dune had been the first proper science fiction hardcover New York Times bestseller wasn't something that I knew. It's kind of buried in Brian Herbert's biography of his father. And then finding out that I had worked with the editor, David Hartwell, who made that happen was like really touching. Um, Discovering, I got to talk to Frank Herbert's widow, Theresa Shackelford, who was his third wife, who frankly had not been interviewed in any capacity since the 80s. And I tracked her down, and she was super amazing. And like learning from her origin story of how she met him was, I mean, I didn't know at all. I think that I sort of erroneously had assumed that like he had had a mistress while Beverly was sick, but that wasn't the case at all. She was a publicist working on the Heretics of Dune tour, didn't know anything about Frank Herbert, didn't want to do the publicity tour, didn't want to be the publicist. She wanted to do a different book and got assigned to him by putting him as a publicist, and then they ended up falling in love. And I didn't know that, you know what I mean, at all. And this is the person that was with him until he died that, was a little younger than him, but, she was 30. She was an adult. She knew what she was doing, and just a lovely, brilliant, nice, down to earth human being, Theresa Shackelford is, who was a book person, right? Like she worked in the book business. And so I connected with her on that. I thought that was really amazing. She's really gracious with her time. Learning that Sterling Lanier, the editor at Chilton Books, who bought Dune, was this like massive Lord of the Rings aficionado. And that's something that you could find online, but like if you start connecting the dots and like really like researching, it's really interesting because you're like, this guy was sending hand carved, little Lord of the Rings figurines to J.R.R. Tolkien in the mail. And this is the guy who was like, I'm gonna call this guy's literary agent and see if I can buy Dune for my automotive repair manual day job that I work at. Like that is bananas. And that detail is known, but people generally say it very glibly. They say, ha ha ha, isn't it funny that Dune was bought by Chilton Books, which is an automotive repair manual? And I'm like, isn't it funny that the person who made that call was this massive Lord of the Rings fan who was a science fiction scholar and writer in his own right, who literally just took his day job's money and was like, I'm going to make Dune into a book. And like, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Like, I wouldn't know if I would be the same kind of reader had this extremely sweet, hilarious man done that, who then meanwhile was mailing J.R.R. Tolkien a copy of Dune, and Tolkien's like, I hate Dune, So I think that like, there you go. Contradictory thoughts, right? Holding contradictory thoughts in your mind. A massive Lord of the Rings fan is responsible for giving us Dune, but the creator of Lord of the Rings hated Dune. And I can like kind of get it, right? Like I kind of get why J.R.R. Tolkien might have hated Dune. It doesn't diminish my love of Dune or my love of The Hobbit, right? Like it doesn't diminish those things at all. We all see the connections between Lord of the Rings and Dune. Frank Herbert probably didn't care, and I say that in my book. So, but what's interesting is that the readers, right? The readers bring those things together. And I think that's really interesting because that's how the history of reading and the history of publishing is sort of, it's that relationship with the books and the readers that sort of unfolds.
Those are both two amazing anecdotes, and it does tie to a question that I had about your interviews, because something that I had thought about the Star Trek book as well was that, like, gosh, all these people are so eloquent when talking about their roles and their involvement here, and they all have such interesting perspectives like years later and stuff like that. And I remember like just thinking that the people said such interesting things. And so like when you're talking to people, like what are your techniques, very selfishly, for getting like the best stories out of people?
Well, as you know, you don't always use everything.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You don't always use everything. I don't know. I think that I have to learn the process all over again. You know what I mean? Every time I interview anybody. I think that my key thing I try to do is to not waste their time with a question they've answered before. And so I try to do a little research ahead of time. However, I will say that sometimes it's good to ask somebody a question they've been asked before, if you let them know that you're about to do that. You know, so like Kyle MacLachlan, right? Brilliant Kyle MacLachlan. Again, like, you know, with Star Trek, I'd been doing a lot of journalistic work on it, just sort of like for articles weekly for my different day jobs. So like I had a lot of material and I kind of knew how to get hold of Star Trek actors. With this, it was very much in the wilderness, where I was like, I had gotten Timothy for a magazine article I'd done for Den of Geek in 2021, and he was wonderful, and that sort of inspired me to do the book. Just like being like talking to Timothy Chalamet on the phone and being like, this is amazing. You know, I'm talking to Timothy Chalamet. This was before the movie came out. You know what I mean? And so that was kind of like the inkling. I was like, in 2021 summer, I was kind of like, maybe I should do a Dune book. Like, because I was so moved by that conversation. And it wasn't very long, right? But, you know, as a writer and as an essayist, you're always like, I mean, David Sedaris can, you know, look at a peanut and turn that into 5,000 words, and that's amazing. So I'm like, I can stretch Chalamet, you know, to a couple pages, you know. But so even getting Kyle and Alec Newman, who played Paul in the 2000 and the 2003 miniseries, was like, I was just really having to, you know, like, let's get on, you know, IMDb, let's find their agent. That didn't work. Let's find somebody else who's their publicist. That didn't work. Let's see if we can track them down. And really make it clear that this isn't like a super geeky, you know, deep dive. This is like a let's have fun and talk about Dune. So with Kyle, I had to ask him some questions he'd been asked before, Jen. You know what I mean? And Jessica, like I had to be like, okay, I'm about to ask you something that I know you've answered before, because I have this magazine from 1985 in which you were asked this question. But I would like to get my own version of it, is what I said to him. And he said, you know what? I don't mind answering those questions, because it's sometimes people get things confused or they get taken out of context. So I'm happy to go over this again. You know what I mean? So I got my version, right, of Kyle's origin story of, you know, being in Seattle, working in theater, and then David Lynch's casting people coming in and sort of, you know, discovering him. It's not too different than the other versions that he has said in other interviews, but it was my version of that, my conversation with him. So sometimes you have to be okay with your interview subject kind of like going into a story that you've actually already heard before, because you've been doing research on a subject. And having interviewed Star Trek actors and Star Wars writers, or, you know, anybody, you know, people that worked on James Bond movies or whatever, I often find that I'm like, I've heard this one before, you know, and then you get scared because you're like, oh, I only have so much time, you know. So I guess my other trick is also trying to figure out how to talk about something that I maybe know that I'm not going to use, just to lighten people up. So that's something that I'll do, because you're doing a medium of podcasts, and so you can edit stuff out too. But in print, you really can, right? You could be like, well, I kind of knew I wasn't going to use that, but I kind of wanted to like get on the same page, and sort of be like an icebreaker, or just, you know, an anecdote that I think that they'll appreciate, that's quick, and that can kind of so I don't know, a lot of different. But you know, the other thing is that to get people to talk about the thing briefly that you're not actually talking about. So like I was able to get some quotes from Patrick Stewart for this book while I was interviewing him about a Star Trek thing, right? You know, so like I'm interviewing him, you know, like 7 months before Picard season 3 came out. I'm like interviewing for that because I got sent it way early, and it's like top secret, and I'm doing like this interview with Patrick Stewart in the same, I mean, I'm on Zoom in the same recording room I'm in now. And I was like, I'm going to slip in a Dune question in the middle of this interview, because it's going to break it up, and it's going to be great because I'm working on a Dune book. And he was like, oh, I'd love to talk about Dune, you know. And now you see his autobiography just came out, his memoir, and he is very effusive about Dune. And I'm like, yeah, that's the same thing he said to me. He's got his story down, but it's okay that I got my version of it, you know, like
You know, something that really interested me too is that you look at the impact of the books and the way that it travels through these different media forms, but you also kind of look at the subtle ways in which it influenced other media around it. And it really prompted me to reconsider a lot of other like sci-fi or horror or what genre, whatever stuff that I had loved for years. Like you mentioned Beetlejuice, and like I was like, oh my God, I never even saw it in that lens. Like, so
Oh my God, really?
yeah, like that, like
the sandworms, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
like, yeah,
I was like, oh yeah, and so it's super fun, once you kind of when you're reading the book and your head is sort of like in that space, it becomes like the lens with which you see all the media, that you're watching. And it's really fun to like trace the influence, of a property that way. So yeah, like what, like, did you rewatch a lot of the media also that it influenced, not just the Dune?
yeah. Well, like Tremors, like I watched the first two Tremors movies, and I was actually just texting with a friend because he was like texting me his like Halloween movie list he was doing with his wife, and Tremors was on there. I was like, I watched Tremors when I was researching my Dune book. But there's also stuff, Jen, that like I felt like was so obvious that I didn't even get into, like Avatar. You know what I mean? Where it's just like it's just Dune with water. Okay. It's just Dune with water. Like it is, but but it's also like, sorry, Avatar people, but it's also kind of like it's also really obvious in this way that like Dune is not. But the flip side of that is like, well, Cameron would there's no way that he would have done those movies if Dune hadn't existed, because it's just there. They just gave it to him. He's like, what if it was water? And the spice was the unobtainium, and Jake it's not the Fremen, they're the Na'vi. It's the same thing. It's such a ripoff that I actually was like, having a rant about this will actually be like sort of boring, and so I'll just save it for the interviews, that I'm doing about it. But I think that's sort of and maybe I should have put it in there upon retrospect, because those are like some of the biggest movies ever, and I'm like, maybe I missed out. But I was kind of like, we kind of like hit the Star Wars gong pretty hard in that one chapter. I didn't necessarily, and I like Avatar. Okay, I think that as a book science fiction person, it's sort of as eye rolly to me a bit, because ultimately I don't need good special effects. You know what I mean? Like ultimately, like when people are like, oh, but it's got great effects, I'm kind of like, well, my wife and I just watched the new Wes Anderson shorts, on Netflix the other night, and it's kind of like, this is kind of like, I just kind of want like a sci-fi movie like that. You know what I mean? Like if like that's kind of what I love. I love Doctor Who, and I love the '84 Dune film. And was at the time that the production values of that were very beautiful, but they were also very ornate and intricate and specific. And then you watch like the 2003 Children of Dune with James McAvoy and like Susan Sarandon, and some of those costumes are wild, and I love that late 90s early aughts kind of like Babylon 5, like we've got $5 but let's make it look really nuts. So when it comes to Dune's impact on things, I'm a little bit more, and I mentioned this very briefly in the book, like Captain Sisko in Deep Space Nine doesn't really exist without Dune. His story is kind of he's kind of like Paul and Jessica as one character in a way. And I mentioned that briefly in my book, that it's like, interestingly enough, this is like Deep Space Nine, and then you get to he's seeing his mother created him and to be the prophet, and it's kind of like, okay. And they're going to a planet, I didn't want to come here, but I guess we're here, and now we're taking over, so all that stuff, and Ron Moore and those Star Trek writers would cop to that instantly, and it was like, oh yeah, that's totally Dune. But I think that more subtle and made more interesting in that case. But yeah, I think that there's almost too much influence it has. I had thought about writing about Grimes a little bit more than I did, because because it's like Grimes's first album was called Geedy Primes, which is the homeworld of the Harkonnens. And you see these interviews she did in Vanity Fair where she thinks she is Lady Jessica. And she's like, I am Lady Jessica, and Elon Musk is Duke Leto. And I'm like, Elon Musk is kind of like Leto the second, but whatever. Or he's like the Baron Harkonnen. I don't know. But they're definitely Dune characters, right? Like like Grimes and Elon Musk are definitely Dune characters. I'm not sure they're characters that we like. Like I'm not sure they're like people that we're like admire, but and so it was. But again, I was sort of like, I was caught on how much I could really stop talking about Dune. You know what I mean? I'm like, do I want to do like 2,000 words on Grimes? I'm like, I think I might lose some people. So it was almost like with the cultural references, I had to there's almost more than I even could mention. I thought maybe if I do another edition, I might actually go further on that, because I may have just been like so I was like, no, bring it back to Dune, bring it back to Dune. You know, that I might have maybe could have gone further. I don't know.
Did you find yourself sort of rewriting and re-editing this one a lot because you wanted to put so much more in? I mean, it sounds it sounds like you had so much material to work with, and was it hard for you to kind of kill your darlings on this one?
I'm pretty good at cutting things, I have to say, Jessica. You know, like I'm pretty good at being like, okay, let's get real. Like, what is this dragging? You know, one thing that I think we get to do in writing that we don't get to do in life is to be concise, right? Like, and like where you're like, my goal with my books and even small articles that I do online is to be like, this is like talking to me, but better because I'm not rambling, you know, and I've had a chance to sort of, you know, but that it would be a good avatar for me, a good clone of me, my book or my article or essay or whatever. You know, because I think that that's really the only way I've learned how to write. So no, I think that editing, and I've told this to writing students for years, is that, you know, cutting things is writing too. You know, like it's also like whenever you like, it's a decision a writer can make, right? Like if an editor comes back to you or a teacher and is like, I'd like more of this, you're always like, oh my God, what do they mean? That's so hard. But if somebody's like, you could probably cut this, you're like, thank God it's a decision I can make, which is a yes or a no. But yeah, I there was a pretty big restructuring that was done kind of late in the game on this, which was to bring up some of the biographical material about Beverly Herbert a lot sooner in the book. And so that was a big sort of rewrite. And then I sort of again was sort of like, well, I don't know how bogged down I want to get on all the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson sequel books. Because, and I did want to mention them, and I did want to talk about them in the context of 1999, 2000, and 2001, in terms of all of that. But to me, it was like, that's not the type of book this is. You know what I mean? This is not like a giant 2-volume, you know, and, you know, having worked in science fiction publishing and having worked for the publisher who put those out, I know that there's a fair amount of controversy that fans have strong feelings about them. But at the same time, like, you know, I didn't want to like, I definitely had some versions of those where I was perhaps a little bit more opinionated in some of those sections about those books. And then I was kind of like, you know what, this isn't worth it. I'm just going to like talk about what they're about and how they influenced it. And I'm not going to like plant my flag one way or another, really, because I do like some aspects of those books, particularly some of the earlier ones from 99 and 2000. But, you know, I think there's some other things where it's kind of like, well, there's a reason why the first 3 books by Herbert are the most popular still. And I like, you know, the second 3 that he wrote too, but, you know, those are all written pretty quickly in the 80s, you know, God Emperor and Heretics and Chapter House. And I think that there's a reason why the first 3, the original Dune trilogy, are still extremely popular. And I think that it's just the characters. So anything that got me away from like the best parts of the characters of Dune, I was kind of like, I'm probably gonna cut this. You know.
I'm really interested in that divisiveness, not just about the books, but about like the movie adaptations, which I feel like is another thing it shares with Star Trek. Like people tend to view those very divisively too. The David Lynch one is certainly extremely divisive, even though like the actors themselves often have good memories of being in it. I personally love it because I think it is the one that just captures like the weirdness and the grossness.
Yeah. That's good. Perfect way of putting it. I love that.
And even the newest one is, you know, even though it's critically acclaimed in a lot of ways, like people feel very divisive about that one too. Like, why do you think like, I mean, a lot of it is probably just online culture making everything divisive. But like, why?
I mean, because I think because Dune has always been, you know, and this is something that I tried to fight back against, right? Like I worked in books. I've been working in bookstores since I was 17, right? So I had a job at Barnes and Noble when I was in high school, and you know, I had a lot of sci-fi reader friends who were older than me, who were kind of my like, you know, it was like the record store in High Fidelity. You know, they were all kind of snobby, but it was science fiction instead of records. You know, and I made a joke in my first book about this in 2015, my first essay collection, where I was kind of like, you sometimes got the sense where it was like, you don't even get Dune. Like, even if you read Dune, you're gonna ruin it. Like where it was like Dune was just too deep, man. And I was kind of like, I'm gonna push back against this. Like, Dune is cool, and been a science fiction bestseller for a long time. And yes, there are nuanced, contradictory ideas within the novel and the subsequent sequels, but I don't think it's like this unknowable thing. So I think that there's been a fair amount of gatekeeping, right? Like in the science fiction reader fandom. Maybe it's possible that Herbert accidentally cultivated that himself by sort of claiming that it always had one sort of message when it has contradictory messages right within it. I mean, I say this in the book, but he defends the ending of the first novel where Jessica says to Cheney, history will call us wives. He defends this as high camp in 1968, 1969. And it's kind of like, is it though? Like, and I talked to some scholars. Kara Kennedy, who's this great Dune scholar, and she's kind of like, well, I actually think that you could read that ending in a feminist light because they're sort of rejecting the idea that they would need titles to bestow power and all this stuff. And I think that that's a fair reading of it too, but I also understand like the opposite readings. The point is that like it's okay if people have different readings of Dune. And I think that even before the internet, that there was a fair amount of gatekeeping from folks to just be like, you don't understand, you've read this wrong. And I think that I heard that even when I was a teenager. And then as I became like a science fiction sort of critic and sort of entertainment journalist, I was sort of like, these people didn't know what they were talking about. Like, it's okay to read this in different ways. And I think that's true of Star Trek and Star Wars as well, right? I think that where there's like people like, oh, the point of this is like, no, there's like multiple readings here. And none of the readings are like oppression is good, and bigotry is good. None of those readings don't exist. But I think that there are multiple nuances. And in terms of the divisiveness with the film adaptations, Jen, I agree with you. Like, I actually really love the Lynch version because it feels the most like a book, and it because all those voiceovers are like there's a roving omniscient narration to the novel where he's constantly in the head of the shout out Mapes, or he's in the head of Jessica. And now we're what is Thufir thinking? All of that is nuts and hard to capture cinematically. So I think that Lynch, in the same way that we were talking about Wes Anderson earlier, where it's like having characters really inhabit short story characters rather than film characters, where they're saying he said and she said, and all that stuff. Lynch doesn't go that far with the 84 Dune, but I think that he gets closer to like what it's like to read it. So I think that divisiveness is just because it's a hard book to adapt because of the multiple points of view. People are always like, oh, it's a hard book to adapt because of the scale and the politics and the messaging. I'm like, I just think it's because it's got a lot of characters, and that a lot of the information we learn from those characters is in their heads, right? Like, we learn things about Lady Jessica in the second half of the book, which I'm interested to see how the new now 2024 film handles this, because it's like some of the best stuff is when characters are sort of alone or reflecting. And I think that Lynch tried to capture that. But one thing I will say about Dune that is very different than other science fiction franchises is that, in Star Wars and in Star Trek or in Doctor Who or Lord of the Rings or whatever, there's some level of debate of like what is the best, right? And that there are nuances where people will be like, no, the next generation is definitely better than the original series. No, it's Deep Space Nine. Or, with Star Wars, like, no, actually the prequels are George Lucas's vision and blah, blah, blah. There is a vanishingly small, you get like, I should say, there's diminishing returns on that debate in Dune. It's like the first novel is the best one, and like there is like an overwhelming agreement on that from Dune fans. So it's like, it's like if everybody that read Lord of the Rings said that The Hobbit was their favorite. No, there is like gradients there. People say, actually, I like Return of the King, or, whatever. And yes, people have said to me like, oh, well, people say God Emperor is the best. I was like, no. Most people just say it's the first novel. And I think there's something to that that's interesting, because he had really intended that first novel. He had tried to sell it at one point as 3 books, because and there's a lot in it. And I think that the first 3 books do tell a very interesting story, but you can't beat the first book. you just can't beat it. And I think that that is telling. It's kind of like got it right away. You know, what's your favorite Dune aspects like? Or do you have a favorite Dune book? Do you have a favorite Dune character? Both of you, I'm curious.
The first book is my favorite. And even though she is pretty divisive and there's really great reasons not to like her, I do really love Jessica. Like I think she was, because the time in my life when I read it for the first time too, she was like one of the first women in sci-fi that was like allowed to be like really complex and have rough edges and not be likable or sexy, which was a thing for a lot of women in sci-fi for a long time. So I really appreciated at a young age that she was just allowed to be like a fully fleshed out character.
And for me, I just love the mythology and the politics. Honestly, I really am a huge fan of big, complicated stories with lots of plot twists and lots of characters, and things that feel very tangible, even though they're not necessarily set in our world. You feel them. You're like, okay, this is a really just sort of well thought out uh, way to sort of bring those thoughts into a science fiction aspect. So, and as a mythology fan myself, obviously I just like all of the
If I can jump on that, you're interviewing us now. This is the tables
yeah,
of
for
charts.
sure.
I also love like that it's a book where like it feels like the ideas or the philosophy sometimes take precedence over the characters or the plot, but that doesn't feel really heavy-handed or artificial. Like I don't feel like I'm ever, reading like John Galt's monologue, like when I'm
Yeah.
reading Dune. It's like it centers the philosophy without while still being a novel that is like engaging.
Well, I think that's what I meant when I was sort of trash talking Avatar. Is like that to me is the opposite of Avatar, right? Where like the characters do feel very like sort of like particularly the villains, like they feel very um one dimensional and sort of just there to do and say the things that the philosophy of the movie is trying. But yeah, I agree with you. And with Jessica, something that I have found and something that I found very unique about Dune is that as a parent coming back to it, realizing that the parents aren't like horrible. You know what I mean? That they're actually pretty good parents. And that's, you think about mythology, Jessica, and we think about all the tropes of like, the children who just don't have parents, or their parents, or they're orphaned, or they're dead, or they're evil, or something. And it's like, yes, Duke Leto dies in the first, spoiler alert, guys. Duke Leto dies in the first third, right, of Dune, but Jessica outlives Paul in the later books, right? And she like so in a way, as she's like this strong woman who's also a parent, and that's something that's really interesting, that she's not diminished by being an older mother figure. She's not diminished by being the wife of Duke Leto, and she's not a there are questionable things that Jessica and Leto did to position Paul, or that kind of like, what are they like the college admission scandals, right? Like where they're going to make him the Kwisatz Haderach, like or whatever, like he's a nepo baby, I guess, right? In more the ways than one, and like I love that the way that they did that in the Denis movie. Oh, you have more than one inheritance or whatever, like he has, his mother's side is actually like, I say this in the book, is it's like if like Luke Skywalker's mother had lived, right, and been this interesting sort of complex force in his life, pun intended. That's like what Dune is, and like you just don't find that very often in fantasy or science fiction narratives, where you have not only are the parents relatively good people relative to their parenting of their child, but they're also just like characters in their own right. They're not just like Harry Potter's parents. I mean, could we think of any thinner, characterizations, you know what I mean, than Harry Potter's dad, who just doesn't exist, basically. He's just some memory, right? And Star Wars is guilty of that too, right? Like where it's like kind of like, oh, we didn't really care about Anakin Skywalker until the early aughts, and even then his connection as a parent to Luke is very tenuous. Whereas like with Paul and Alia, particularly Alia's relationship with Jessica and like Children of Dune, when she's grown up and she's kind of like, hey, I got all these memories from our ancestors, mom, thanks a lot. And didn't want this, and then so like, and that they become kind of enemies. And that's sort of fascinating, to think that you're kind of like, you're not like, Jessica wasn't a bad mom, and Alia does have all these memories of like the Baron Harkonnen in her mind. Like that's not her fault either. Like you don't pass judgment on the family drama, I guess. And I think that's something where Jen, I think you hit like where it's like, or Jessica, you just said like it's like mythology, but it's not heavy handed. You're kind of like, well, I kind of buy that if I was a preborn abomination, I would be a little mad at my mom too. But as a reader, I can be like, well, Jessica's still pretty cool. It's like, I guess she's, in the third book, you're kind of like, I guess it's okay that she's like dating Gurney now. I guess I'm all right with that. It's also kind of realistic. You're kind of like, some of my mom's boyfriends after my dad died were a little,
Yeah, you hit on a lot there, and I think that is one of the things I really do like about it. With just the whole idea of, you can be a flawed person but a good parent, and vice versa. It's it and I like you can say that about other characters, but like you didn't like, and maybe it's because the books came after the movies, but like Vader, you didn't see Vader. He wasn't present enough as Anakin for Luke, so much that the characters and the parents in Dune were. So I think you just hit a really perfect nerve there.
Yeah, because I think that it's also just like, if you're reading it like as a kid, you're like a teenager, you're like this, you can identify, if any gender you can identify with Paul because it's a coming of age story. But then you read it as a grown up and you're like, this is like a parenting story because Jessica's like the other protagonist. And you're like, wow, I never, my wife pointed out that her favorite moment was, one of her favorite moments when we watched the Denis Villeneuve movie is like the look that Jessica gives Paul when he's like going to like be with Cheney with Zendaya, right? And it's kind of like, that's a mom look right there, where it's just like, what? Yeah, I'm gonna have to worry about this now, and it's not necessarily like, it's Rebecca Ferguson does it so well that it's not all one way, right? It's not like she's angry or worried or happy. It's all of those things, right? Like she conveys all of that kind of parental, I don't know. I just think that, and I think Oscar Isaac, I got to talk to him briefly when the movie was coming out, for Fatherly, my day job. And I just thought he brought his own dad powers into that role. And all that stuff is just, people are children, but all, children, everyone has their parents. And so I think that we get rid of parents so often in fantasy and science fiction narratives. And Dune doesn't do that at all, ever. You know what I mean? And I think that, even Irulan becoming like the sort of foster parent to Leto and Ganima in the third book is really interesting. Right? Like that's a really interesting role because, Cheney and Paul are dead. And that's really interesting to be like, she's like the aunt who was left behind. But she's also like the most successful author in Dune, right? Like she's written all these, I want Irulan's book deals, well, I'll let you go now.
That was fantastic. And oh my gosh, that's going to give me so much to chew on, just like the last bit that you're talking about in parenting in Dune. So thank you so much, like for writing the book, for coming to talk to us, and for everything. This is really great.
Well, anytime I'll come back.
Awesome.
Okay.
Listeners, it is your turn now. You must go out and get The Spice Must Flow. It's available right now. So head to your library, head to your independent bookstore, wherever you like to get your books. Please go. This has been Jen and my fabulous co-host,
Jessica the librarian.
Ryan Britt. Thank you so much for joining us. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.